Welcome back to another episode of Vivid Noise, and I'm finally doing another racing game, and this one, it's a special one. This right here is Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. I'm sure you've heard of it. I mean, it's only like one of the most talked about, classic nostalgia, I guess, boomer racers at this point. I mean, can we call them those? Because you know how boomer shooters, right? Well, I guess we could have boomer racers, and maybe have to go back a couple generations. Whatever. What I mean is this is an absolute classic, but this is the PS2 version, which is what most people remember. Not me though. I grew up with the PC version, as I've made clear in a lot of my older videos, and I am so annoyed by that because this version is just objectively better. It is insane how much better the PS2 version is, especially considering this was the first Need for Speed game made by Black Box. The legends who made Need for Speed Most Wanted, Need for Speed Underground 2 and Underground 1, Carbon, Pro Street, and fuck it, I like Undercover, Sue Me. The run was okay. I'm not a huge fan of the run, but still, it was a really cool, ambitious game. So it's insane to me that their first ever attempt is so ridiculously well made, and that is actually going to be the main point of this video. I want to talk about games that are so well put together, so polished, so pretty, sound so good, that they don't even feel like they belong to their own series. And that's not to say that, in this case, Need for Speed doesn't have good-looking games. No, of course it does. It has great-looking games. It has great-sounding games. That's the one thing they consistently do really, really well. But it's not just the visuals, but it's also the gameplay, the features, the quality of life stuff, the design, the tiny little decisions that the developers made that make this just not even feel like something made by anyone associated. It's kind of like when a completely separate studio picks up the rights and they just fucking knock it out the park. But before we get into all of that, let's just go over the main differences to anyone who isn't aware, because I can't just assume that everyone who watches my videos, obviously it's kind of a niche thing, so maybe it is safe to assume, but still, I can't expect you guys to know every single little tiny difference between every single version of the game. So let's go into the differences. Well, obviously you can see that the visuals are quite different, and honestly, in retrospect, not in retrospect, but I guess nowadays they're better than the PC version, really, because the only thing for the longest time, the only thing that the PC version had over the PS2 version was the frame rate and resolution. Well, as you can see, I am doing this at 30 frames per second because certain frame rate mods for, emulators can be a little iffy when it comes to game logic and physics, and I just don't want to risk it. I just want it to play as consistently as possible. There's some issues with, like, for example, Sonic Colors. Let's say there's these physics issues with some scripted set pieces. You never know if that might happen with this game, so I'm just going to leave it at 30. It's fine. The resolution, though, as you can see, I've bumped way up to, in this case, 1080p, although really it's actually 1440p, technically speaking, if you were to look at the vertical resolution, but no, as far as the emulator is concerned, it's 1080p, whatever it is. But yeah, it looks great, and it's not just those technical aspects. The texture work, holy shit, the texture work is insanely good for not just PS2 standards, early PS2 standards. This game came out in 2002. This was only 2 years, and really only about 1.5 years after the PS2 was released, as far as Americans are concerned, right? And this is a Western release. So for the developers to have essentially squeezed as much out of the hardware as they possibly could is just, I'm really impressed by this, especially because this is a third-party multi-platform release. This isn't Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo, it's impressive, but it kind of, if you think about it, isn't, because it is exclusive to PlayStation, so it better be. It better run at 60 frames. It better look great, because you can only get it there. But here, Black Box, they only made this version, right? But you had a separate studio that EA also had to fund. I imagine the money was being split between Black Box and EA Seattle, who are making the Xbox, GameCube, and PC version, which is the one that I grew up with. Although, you'd think that more people would have grown up with that version because it's on more platforms, but because of just how much more the PS2 sold, this really is the definitive childhood Need for Speed game for at least like my generation and people slightly older than me. Another difference between this version and the rest of them is the actual track design and selection of tracks. This version actually has I think 3 more tracks. I think it has 3 more what do you call those, like desert tracks. Obviously, they are sort of like these reimaginings of the, I think it was called the Red Rock Ridge area from the original Need for Speed Hot Pursuit, but here it looks a lot nicer. Although I'm kind of almost inclined to say that this version has not more tracks when it comes to the autumn area, just different tracks. The autumn themed place in the game, those tracks, they're completely different between the PC / all the others and the PS2 version. Part of me kind of likes the way they look better in the PC version. They're more colorful, but they're definitely more, I guess, realistic, just better stylized here, if that makes sense. Oh, that's kind of a contradiction. More realistic, better stylized. The style looks better. That's a subjective thing, but yeah, overall, just the effects are a lot more convincing. Everything about this game just, it's crazy. It really is fucking insane how the weakest platform, objectively speaking, the weakest one, the PS2 versus, GameCube, PC, and Xbox especially, had the best looking game. And not just looking, the handling is tight. It's heavy, but it's got like this really good sense of presence, so the cars are not too floaty, but it's not too punishing either. It's an incredibly good balance, whereas the rest of the versions are just kind of, they're floaty. They feel like they took the Porsche Unleashed handling and then just kind of tweaked with some, they tweaked a few of the values to make it less difficult. So they made the cars a little lighter, maybe increased the grip, but not in a way that makes it better to play. Funnily enough, you can modify the hell out of it. You can just open up a text document in the PC version and change the car handling to your liking. So I guess with enough tweaking, the PC version could handle better, but does that really count if you have to essentially redesign the game? No, I don't think that counts. And aside from the fundamental differences, there's also a ton of little quality of life improvements that have been made between the versions that really proved to me that Black Box did their homework, so to speak. I mean, a lot of little shit that you'll only notice if you've played every version of the previous Need for Speeds. For example, you might have noticed the last race, I got busted, but I didn't have to redo the race. That's because, unlike the PC version, it's a free strikes and you're out system, which is exactly how the older versions of Need for Speed used to play on both consoles. Both systems, both on PC, both and on PS1. They function that same way. You would get busted once, and it's like, oh, don't do that again, bitch. And then you get busted again, and it's like, wow, I don't see the fire, but you seem to be headed for a smoke. And that is me being very dyslexic. God damn. But you get the idea. And then you get busted again, that's when it's game over. Same thing here. You can get busted 2 times before it's actually the end of the race, which is great because the races in this game are very long. So imagine getting busted right at the end, which has happened to me in the PC version, and that's just so much fun. It's great. I love having to redo like 10 to 15 minutes of driving on these not super visually interesting tracks in the PC version. Yeah, it's great. No, seriously, I had like this phase where I used to genuinely consider Hot Pursuit 2 to be like a terrible game. Now that I know that there's a much better version out there, of course the one that I don't have nostalgia for, go figure, no, I take it back. This is a great game if you play it this way, which fortunately now is super easy. You don't need to actually dig up a PS2 to do that. I mean, come on, you think I'm actually playing this on a PS2? No, you can clearly tell I'm not. I love it when YouTubers, they'll be showing you like this ultra 4K footage of what's obviously a console game, and they'll say some shit like, well, actually, I'm not playing this on a real, let's say, Nintendo 3DS. And I'm just like, what? No way, dude, I thought you were totally playing this on an actual piece of hardware from 2011 that's handheld and has like 5 kilobits of video memory. Of course it can handle a 4K output. Anyway, back to Need for Speed. Another small touch, which actually isn't small at all, is the way that the developers handled, the time trial events. The one I'm doing right now, actually, the one you're looking at, unlike the PC version where you basically just, PC, all of them, the other versions, unlike those versions, you don't have to actually complete free laps or however many laps they give you, only for, one of them to be the fast one, the one that's fast enough to complete the event. No, here, if you just do one lap and it's good enough, that's it. You win. And that's awesome. In fact, you'll see it right here. I don't know how I was able to do it because it took me quite a few takes, but eventually I got a fast enough lap on my first go, right, on my first run, which never happens because... Actually, hold on, wait. Yeah, it's the first lap. I had to look at my footage for it, but yeah, it is the first lap, which was the one that made it into the final take. And because usually the second lap is faster because you get a rolling start and everything, but still, the fact that you don't have to do it any more than the absolute bare minimum, that's great because it just saves you time. I mean, who wants to, like, you get a fast enough time the first lap, and then, well, you're just doing victory laps at that point, and it's not really that fun, right? That's a great little quality of life addition. Not to mention, there's also this mechanic that I'm sure I've showed off a couple times so far, and it's what's called the zone freeze and zone zoom feature. Essentially what those two things do is, well, one of them, I think it's the zone freeze, it basically just spins your camera around, kind of like how it does in the PC version when you pause the game. It's just there to sort of help you get your bearings, you know, where the cops are relative to you. But another thing is the zone zoom, which sends like a fireball out and allows you to actually see what is upcoming. As in, specifically, I'm talking about the cops. Like, it actually freezes on any roadblocks or just potential threats to you as a racer, right? I mean, the cops don't have that feature. I don't think they do, at least. Maybe they do it. I don't know. But you don't really need them because, speaking of the cops, as you can see right here, I'm about to use what's called, maybe you've heard of this one, it's called nitrous, which, like, every fucking racing game has, basically. Every racing game of this type, every arcade racer, basically, has nitrous, which is activated with L3, which is a little weird, but you know, when you're using a modern controller, it's not that bad. But yeah, it's actually unlimited when you're the cops, which you'd think would be overpowered, but it's really not that broken. It actually reduces your car's grip significantly, so it's pretty tricky to handle. It really isn't some, you know, just mega win button. You just hit it and boom, you done the race. No. As you can see, you still have to actually try and steer. Another really cool addition is the way the look back camera works. It functions exactly like how it used to in Need for Speed High Stakes. I mean, that's why I said I feel like Black Box did their homework for this game, because that is exactly how it worked in the old games, where it actually snaps to the closest opponent or cop car. It's a tiny little thing. It doesn't really affect the gameplay too much, but it really does make me feel like Black Box, you know, they were fans of what they were doing, and that's why we missed them so much, really. There was just so much passion there. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm missing even, like, more features that this version does differently and better than the rest of the versions, but it really just goes to show this game is insane. And what I want to talk about now with the rest of this video is this really interesting phenomenon I've noticed across different game series when a particular entry, one, maybe two, but usually it's just one entry that has so much going for it and does so many things so well that you almost have a hard time believing that it was made by the same people, that it belongs to the same brand. With this game, for example, I'm not saying the rest of the Need for Speeds aren't as good. No, they're pretty damn good. Underground, Underground 2, Most Wanted, Carbon. Again, I like Undercover, Sue Me, Pro Street, etc., right? This is just a golden era for these kind of games. But this one, all those little things I mentioned, they really add up, and the whole game just has this incredibly tight sort of feel to it. Everything feels perfectly in place. It is a perfectly executed arcade racer, and that's just incredible to me, really, because the future games would always have something that is a little bit not where it's supposed to be, even if the game overall is really good. And it's that level of quality with this game in particular that makes it sort of hard to comprehend the fact that it belongs to the same series, because it's just the level of quality is so much higher. And it's not even that big of a jump, but it's tiny improvements in a lot of different areas which add up. This has nothing to do with the identity of the game from a stylistic standpoint or what the gameplay is like, because Need for Speed will always have that cops and robbers sort of cops and racers kind of element to it, with the modern Hot Pursuit style games like Hot Pursuit 2010 / the remaster, and also Rivals. There will always be that element, and not to mention that's where the franchise actually started. So it has nothing to do with that. It's not because it's so different, because actually for the time it wasn't so different. This really was just a natural progression. If anything, Porsche Unleashed was the odd one out, which ended up actually paving the way for what would end up becoming the standard for the series, with car customization and a little bit more damage, with Pro Street and stuff like that. Looking outside of just the Need for Speed franchise, there's tons of other games I can think of which fall into that category. Another racing game would be Race Driver Grid. I love Codemasters. I'm sure you're aware of this. They're an absolutely fantastic studio. In fact, I've actually got a video planned to do on another one of their games. Actually, I'm going to be doing Colin McRae Rally Free soon, so look forward to that. And I love their work, but man, Grid, they were possessed at that point. I have no idea how they came up with just something so well made. It's not my favorite. It really isn't my favorite Codemasters racing game, but everything about it, the presentation, the structure of the game, the way the cars handle, the track design, it's just that perfect storm. Everything works so well. I would have to make a whole ass scripted review analysis type video, but actually no, I'm pretty sure someone else made a really good one a while ago. Yeah, the video was made How Grid Managed to Rock the Racing World, I think. It was by Mr. XBAS, or Mr. X Bass, or whatever. Yeah, it's a really good video, so me making one would be kind of redundant, but yeah, go watch that one. Because really, you have to understand just how fucking polished and how well made that game was, and to the point where it doesn't even feel like it was made by Codemasters. It feels like it was made by some super studio from a different dimension. Another example would be the Mario Galaxy games. It's no secret that Mario's games, just overall, are extremely well made, well designed, they look nice for the most part, they sound pretty good, but with Mario Galaxy, it's on a completely different level. I guess you could say it's it's on a cosmic scale, but really, it is incredible. The orchestral soundtrack, the camera angles, the big swoops, it doesn't feel like anything else Mario's ever made or ever will make. They're never going to make a Mario Galaxy free. Those games sold really well, but Nintendo, right? I mean, if they went off what sold well, then they would just keep making the same Mario game over and over and over again, because that one, I'm sure that even early on, they did really, really well. That's why they've stuck around. But no, they're not content with that, and that's okay, but goddamn, Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, and especially 2, it's weird. I look at them and I think, okay, this is a game featuring Mario, but it's not a Mario game. It has the Mario gameplay. This isn't a case of, oh, it has this character in it, but it doesn't play like how it's supposed to. No, it plays like Mario, looks like Mario, sounds like Mario, but everything is just taken to a completely different level. And notice has nothing to do with the fact that I've watched Nintendo Capri Sun's Let's Plays as a kid. I just really, really appreciate the production value of the game. Another example would be Serious Sam 2. It's the exact opposite of my problem with Serious Sam 3 that I talked about in my Serious Sam Next Encounter video. That game, Serious Sam 2, is ridiculously polished in gameplay. The cutscenes look like ass, honestly. They're written terribly, but come on. I guess it was just supposed to be like Crow Team just kind of messing around. That game is a really interesting example of, a small studio just being suddenly acquired by a large publisher and being given a massive budget and just like, okay, go and make this insane thing. And yeah, it turned out kind of weird. It's kind of like when like a small band suddenly gets signed to a major label, and it's just like, okay, you got all this money. What do we do? I have no idea. And then the album ends up a mess. It's actually really interesting. I wanted to make this comparison later, but I guess I'm making it now. It's about how sometimes these kind of games can feel like that one song by a band that's like really popular, but when you listen to the rest of their stuff, it sounds nothing like it. My dad used to make this really good comparison, how Kiss, what was it? I Was Made for Loving You. That sounds nothing like the rest of their stuff. I don't really listen to them, but, I watch The Art of Guitar, and he's a huge fan, so I kind of have inadvertently heard a bunch of their stuff. And yeah, it really does sound totally different. Or even something like, I don't know, some normie shit, like Enter Sandman, right, by Metallica. You can clearly tell it's like a Metallica song, but it still has a very different sort of groove, very different sound to it compared to anything else on the Black Album, even. It's just strange how that happens. Is it because it's popular, or is it because it's different that it became popular? We don't know. It's a very what came first, chicken or the egg kind of situation. Or, well, no, with some bands, it's not really the case. Like Numb, Linkin Park. It's like, no, that's a Linkin Park song, really. I can't really think of any of their songs that don't sound like how they usually do, respective to the era that we're talking about, because they change sound many, many times. But yeah, but back to Serious Sam 2. When in-game, that game is ridiculously polished. Insane. The color palette is great. super colorful, a little too saturated for my taste, but you can tweak your NVIDIA control panel settings to sort of fix that. Or maybe, I think there's actually in-game settings for that. The first few encounters had in-game saturation settings, so I'm sure that Serious Sam 2 does as well. They wouldn't remove it from the engine. But other than that, though, the sound design, everything's very clicky, very punchy. Not quite as aggressive. It has like a softer sort of feel to it, but it's still, you kind of forget that this was made by that same small studio. But then Serious Sam 3 came out and it was like, oh yeah, they're biting off a little more than they could chew. I know they were in a very different position at that point financially. There was supposed to be a very different kind of game, reused assets. We all know the story. Something I also want to clarify as far as this whole, that one game that's so much better phenomenon is concerned, is it doesn't have anything to do with my opinion on the gameplay itself, because I'm not the biggest fan of Serious Sam 2. I already said I don't love Race Driver Grid. It's a really, really good game. I understand that, but I have my own preferences and kind of don't really want to play it all the time. It's great to pick up and play occasionally, but I'd rather be playing something like, I don't know, a Dirt 1 or Dirt 2, Dirt 3. I love the Dirt games. Like, Codemasters do really fucking good off-road games. The point is that this sort of dissonance between the game's belonging to a certain brand and its quality and how you sort of perceive it, it occurs not because of how you feel about the game, but because of a collection of just tiny little design choices, elements of the game's production that accumulate into this very unfamiliar kind of feeling to it. Just like with Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 here, you don't really feel it like a Need for Speed game. At least I don't, if that makes sense. Because to me, games are mostly about feel. So, like, to me, as I've already said multiple times, games are a sort of art form. Really, you feel things like when you play, I don't know, Sonic Riders. I'm actually doing a video on that game later, and I'm gonna repeat this in that video. But when I play Sonic Riders, I'm not thinking about the mechanics. Oh, I really like them. I'll get into that later. But I feel like it's the brightest day in the world. Everything just feels so sunny just by booting that game up, launching Metropolis. What was it called? Metal City. It was called Metal City, the first level of the game, and just instantly everything's just, it glows. Like the world glows when you're playing that game. It's this really weird thing that I might have to do an entirely separate video on, just talking about how I feel when those kind of things happen in video games, because it really is something that can really hardly, it's very difficult to describe, but it is worth a shot. I would love to try and do that. Funnily enough, for the longest time, I used to actually feel the way that I feel towards Hot Pursuit 2 about Most Wanted in a weird way. I would sometimes forget, oh yeah, Most Wanted is a Need for Speed game because it's just so damn good. After playing Most Wanted through a couple more times and actually completing it for the first time recently, because, I never really complete Need for Speed games that often. For some reason, I've completed Payback like 5 times, but I've never completed Most Wanted until recently. It's just because of how long they can be and the way the games are structured. They're not conducive, to me at least, for full playthroughs. But hey, I did it, and I still think it's an amazing game. It's the best Need for Speed game, but there's just something about Hot Pursuit 2 that feels like the best game out of the Need for Speed games, if that makes sense. Like Most Wanted is the best Need for Speed game, but Hot Pursuit 2 on PS2 specifically is a better just standalone kind of experience, if that makes sense. It's just, again, so tightly put together, whereas in Most Wanted there's like a couple oversights in the pacing. Sometimes the cops really take a while until they get really good, though they do get really good later on at higher wanted levels. And it's not perfect. Not to say that this game is perfect either. It's not. No game is perfect, but it's just there's so little that can go wrong that it almost feels like it's perfect, right? Because of how much simpler it is. It's not quite as ambitious, but it just does what it does really well. And that's about all the time we have for this episode of Vivid Noise. Really hope you enjoyed it. Next one's most likely going to be about a certain 2D platformer or another racing game. We'll see which one I decide to schedule first, because, I make these in advance. Yeah, I hope you enjoy this, and I'll see you at the next one.